podcast. First of all, I'd like to thank Ashton and thank all of you for joining this conversation. Just a little bit of background for everyone who's listening in. We've been united through the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, which is an organization that I advise for, and York is a co-chair of the board on. We advise the City of Austin on an identity project that they're working on. So we have two amazing representatives from the City of Austin. And then we have two participants from our recent incubator, Wolfpack, who were one of the winners of the Sustainable Cities Prize. So I'll let you go around and introduce yourselves, and we'll start with Pablo.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Pablo. I am one of the guys that Mary just mentioned. I'm with the City of Austin. I started very differently, though. My career actually started in journalism. I was a journalist before I was a UX designer. Worked in a couple of projects with companies like Airbnb, Delta Airlines, Pixar Global, Samsung, and kind of found my calling in UX design and UX research, and it's what I do full time. So here we are. Hopefully, we'll get some time to talk about the My Past project as well, so you guys can sort of understand what we're doing there.
I'm Adam Wiedemann. I'm also from the City of Austin. As Pablo mentioned, we kicked off a project a while ago to specifically to help establish identification for people experiencing homelessness. And as we're going to get into today, when we hired Pablo, it was mostly because of his journalism background. Doing technology work and having a really keen humanitarian understanding of the importance of your work and who the users are and what is important to them is critical to providing solutions that real people can use. And so yeah, because of that, we're super stoked to have Pablo on the team.
Thanks, Alan.
Bill, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, UX design seems to save the world. So I'm Bill Sterling, one of the co-founders of Indigo Theory, and I tend to use technology and human-centered design to make life a little bit easier and smarter. I'm drawn towards the empathy and finding simple solutions. I think, I've competed in about 4 hackathons now, and all of them around blockchain, and I'm drawn to it because of the unlimited potential that it has to really have an impact on like our ancient constructs that really prevent us from growing. And I really look forward to the bigger problems to solve. And holding everyone accountable, but at the same time freeing us. So I look forward to discussing this.
Alex, do you want to go next? Oh, you're muted, Alex.
I'm muted. I did it. My name's Alex Gardner. I am the CEO of Indigo Theory. So we are a blockchain-based company that is focusing on projects that are rooted in empathy using human-centered design. So our core project that we're focusing on right now is Wolfpack. That's the one that Mary mentioned that placed at the Blockchain for Social Impact Incubator. We were also the winners of this year's Ethereum Denver Impact Track, the UX Award, as well as Victolic's Choice Award. So we're both user experience designers that, as Bill mentioned, just see the endless possibilities and potential of blockchain. So that's really where we've chosen to put our effort and our passions. And it's one of those things that really you need to focus on your user for it to succeed. And so that's why we're so excited to be involved in this space.
Thanks, Alex. York?
All right, so amazing to be talking to you all again together. As I said, this is like our Friday lunch conversation. And yes, it's been a busy week. We just did our the culmination of the 6-week Blockchain Decentralized Impact Incubator with Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, where I'm a board member. And it's so amazing to have advisors like Mary and Adam participating in projects like that. And then obviously congratulations to the Wolfpack team on the award. So it was pretty amazing. I think the the comments coming out of the incubator were along the lines of, I've never seen this type of production in a hackathon before. And that's why we call it an incubator, because it is a little bit more longer than a 2-day hackathon, and much more like a typical accelerator or incubator with a lot of coaching, and Murray can attest to that.
Yeah, and I think that leads well to our first question, and I want you both to talk about the projects that you're working on. The first question is not about technology, it's about legal identity. What is it and why does it matter? And I think both of your projects really demonstrate why it matters. So we'll start off with Alex to go into that question, and then we can spitball from there.
Yeah, no, and it's a great first question, right? So when we talk about legal identity, you know, in its most natural sense, it's the registration and documentation of a person, and that enables them to access things like rights and benefits. And what it does is it ties you to a country. It says that you belong here, you are identified here, you are rooted here. And so I come from a family of immigrants. I know when my grandmother became an American citizen from Italy, she said that that was one of the proudest, greatest days of her life. Like, that was more rewarding than her first kid or getting married. She said, I belonged somewhere. I had spent so many years in limbo. And when I got my citizenship, I mean, that meant everything to her. And so when we generally think of identity, we think of it as this very, very positive thing. But what we don't think about is that having a positive sense of identity is actually quite a privilege, and that many groups don't experience identity the same way that you or I do. And so when we talk through identity in some of our demographics of the people that it affects negatively, you know, we're talking about groups that are homeless or unhomed. We're talking about groups that have been incarcerated. We're talking about immigrants. And so two of the groups that I have worked with personally, one being the incarcerated, when we talk about identity, their identity is rooted in their incarceration. It is rooted to this criminal record that they have. And it doesn't matter what they do to try to fix it, they will always be sort of maimed and marked with this criminal identity that has been given to them and is permanently there. And there's not a lot that they can do to change that. And a lot of these people have criminal activity or criminal records because they're just coming from poor backgrounds. You're talking about drug crimes, you know, small theft, petty crimes, because that's what you have to do to survive those situations. And we see that directly correlating to those who are experiencing homelessness. Bill and I's project Wolfpack is all about how do we transition people out of homelessness into the workforce. And when working with a lot of the nonprofits, one of the things that we were shocked to hear was that they don't want identity. It wasn't a simple issue of, you know, getting them access to government records, or, you know, having a government official come in and help them with social security cards, or, you know, a passport or some form of ID. There are nonprofits that are trying to do that. But when we talked to a lot of the nonprofits and the homeless individuals, they said, we don't want to be ID'd. We don't trust the government. We don't trust the police. And I'm like, this is a very interesting concept. And so when I was talking to some of our unhomed members, I said, don't you think it would help you? Like, don't you think having identity would help you get out of being homeless? And they said no, because in the city of Denver, we have decriminalized homelessness, but there's a lot of states and cities that you can be arrested or criminalized for the simple act of not having a home. And like, how ridiculous is that we're going to penalize and criminalize people because they don't have access to an affordable housing unit? And so when we now think of identity, we're thinking about it as this thing that is negatively impacting people. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with Wolfpack to change that is, can we give you identity within your own control? And that's something that blockchain can offer. Can we build reputation? Can we build attestation? Is there a way that somebody in your community or in your encampment can vouch for you and say, yes, you know, I'm vouching that this person's trustworthy? Or, hey, this homeless individual actually was a part of a community project and they, you know, planted tulips in a community garden, or they were responsible for cleaning up their encampment and taking out the trash, or, you know, cleaning up their space. Like, these small wins that we can allow individuals to do to work towards a more positive identity. We're also seeing it in medical. I am actually a type 1 juvenile diabetic, and I never thought in my lifetime that that would be a negative identifying attribute. But I cannot get disability insurance. I cannot get life insurance. I actually cannot be an Uber or Lyft driver. I'll never forget the first time that I lost a job opportunity because they found out I was diabetic. And I never thought that that would be a situation I would find myself in. But we see these marks of identity hurting people, and we never thought that. And so having identity as a positive thing is quite a privilege. And I think one of the things that blockchain can offer is, what if we gave identity back to the user, back to that group, and allowed them to build it in their own way and have control over it?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great space for MyPass to come in and describe what they're doing, because they're working right in that area.
I was about to say, yeah, that is pretty much exactly what we're doing. And something that's worth noting is that we're working with two different users, two different types of users. I think Wolfpack is more concerned about the users that Alex was describing, the people that are sick and tired of government and see absolutely no point in engaging further with them. Our project is focused around the other side, the people that are trying to get access to services and have a hard time doing so because of these documents that describe their identity, which are very easily stolen. They're very easily lost when you're a person experiencing homelessness in the streets. So what MyPass is, it's a digital storage solution for certified copies for original documents that makes the distribution of them possible. So yeah, basically having, a driver's license, a birth certificate, these important documents backed up on a network that is secure, that is private, and that you can share with service providers to get easier access to them. And obviously this is a platform that is for everyone, and that's something that I think is worth sort of elaborating on, because that is one of our findings when building this. We started out with the mission of helping people experiencing homelessness. And then we quickly realized, if we build this platform, if we make MyPass a reality, and we only offer it to people experiencing homelessness, we are labeling them by that very fact. By them using this platform and only being available to them, it makes it so that those negative connotations that they want to avoid, that people experiencing homelessness don't want their identity to be described by their homelessness. It's not something that they are, it's something that they're experiencing, right? So I think making that distinction was important for us, because it helped us realize we have to make this thing for everyone. We have to make MyPass available for every single person that needs to use it, so that the people experiencing homelessness don't feel like this thing is only for them, but it's for everyone. They're included in a larger community, because again, this is a story of ostracizing people, of isolating people, and making them feel like they're no longer part of our functioning world of society. So these are all things that I think we're trying to address, but doing so in a very front curtain sort of way, where we're not going to focus on the back end processes of the government. We're not going to try to make getting a social security card easier, but what we can do is make it so that when you get that important document, you can upload it to the cloud, have it up on a platform, and it is there forever, and you have complete autonomy over that document. You decide how long it's there. You decide who gets to see it. You have complete control over your digital documentation. So yeah, that's what MyPass is all about.
And to be clear, there are lots of people who are trying to fix the Social Security card side of things. It's just that in our particular project, we aren't focused on that.
And also just one clarification, Pablo, you mentioned secure environment. This is actually a secure environment, secure to the constituent, right? That it's not being secured by a permissioning system that someone else has control of. Is that an accurate statement?
That's absolutely right. So the user has complete control over their account. They can decide how long that document is there, whether they want everything deleted. They have complete autonomy over it. And that's really the driving force. The mission behind MyPass is bringing that control, bringing that autonomy over their documentation back to the people, back to everyone.
And to York's point, it's also it's securing the documents in a way that only the people who are uploading them have access to it. And so even though we work for the government and we consider ourselves benevolent actors, we recognize that not everyone in every government is that way. And so consequently, when we're building these tools, we built them to be private by design and private and secure by design, instead of secure by benevolence and private by benevolence, which is a lot of times what you get, even though you're not realizing it.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with our existing legal identity system is that certain populations are invisible in it. They're not treated as equals to other people in the system. And we don't want anyone to be invisible. In an ideal situation, everybody is treated as an equal in the eyes of the government, but we want everyone to also have the option to be anonymous or insecure and have an understanding of themselves and only disclose the information that they're comfortable with disclosing. So what technology enables that? The next question is, what does blockchain technology enable that other technology does not? And I'm going to pass that on to York to kick us off.
Yeah, so we often describe blockchain, public blockchain specifically, as a distributed public key infrastructure because it's a good way to think about one of the key principles and capabilities of that. Not only is it a distributed public key infrastructure, but it's also not owned by essentially or controlled by 5 entities like the DNS system of today of the web, right, which is the identity system of the web. And so that's a pretty important change to how we think about permissioning systems where you, the consumer or the constituent, actually own your root key, and it is basically enabled by a public utility that is not owned by a single institution or person, right? And so this is actually a pretty remarkable change in terms of how we think about identity systems, which typically are centrally controlled. You know, the city of Austin issues credentials, right? Or Microsoft issues credentials to its employees. And so that's a core principle as we think about how do we put control of consumer data back in the hands of the consumers and allow consumers to decide what happens to that data. And in the context of the way we look at identity in a country like the United States, there are certain documents that describe our identity. And those documents, in the most ideal world, could be recognized in a digital form, which would then allow us to actually do a lot more of essentially digital transactions that today require us to do physical in-person transactions or physical notarization of documents, right? And so I think, one of the areas that we've spoken to the city of Austin about before is like, how do you look at some of the legislative levers that you could pull to start unlocking digitization of documents, specifically because that any kind of document, including identity documents, whether it's a driver's license, a passport, working papers, a green card, what have you, right? All of those things will get value from that type of change in legislation. So I think principally, obviously, we have to look at the foundational technologies. The other thing that is important when we look at this technologies, and this is something you alluded to, Adam, is if you're going to allow people to own and control their identity, a number of things have to be true, right? Regardless of the technology. One, it should not be vulnerable to regime change, right? Which is not typically something we describe in the US, but frequently happens in other regions of the world. Why don't you want it to be vulnerable to regime change? Because if somebody decides they want to perform genocide, and they had identifying documents about people and about their history and their life, it would be very easy to identify those people. And so this is, by the way, one of the things that scares the dickens out of a lot of people around surveillance and tracing as it relates to COVID-19 is, oh, let's just open it up temporarily because we need to trace people. Okay, well, once that water is not coming back under the bridge, right?
Yep.
It's long downstream after it passes the bridge. So it's a dangerous proposition. So being able to protect that identifying data about constituents, people, whether they're refugees or citizens of the United States, is an extremely important principle. Because you are imbuing that technology with a lot of responsibility, that is holding your personally identifiable information, your documents, et cetera, you need to be able to back up and recover it in a reasonable way. This is actually an area that I would say we've pretty massively failed at in the blockchain and identity space to date, which I keep telling people we need to do a lot more work there. We have some work that's actually being published next month that is what I'll call protocol level work that, sort of some ideas around backup and recovery that we've spoken about before. The other things are, besides backup and recovery, which is important, is survivability, right? And so let's say I register my identity in a public utility that exists today. What if that public utility doesn't exist in 5 years, right? That's something we have to recognize as a problem that we actually have to solve for, right? We have to have portable, essentially portable storage, portable identities that we can move to other public utilities. I'll pass it back over to you, Mary.
Does anybody else want to say anything on that topic?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up the concept of identities within government, mostly because I think when we consider what an identity is today, we tend to think of what we've been given. And a lot of the documents that we have today that prove who we are and what we are really what the government thinks or individual governments think we are. And too often we're tied to those as well, especially when you think about cross borders and the world economy. Sometimes these borders don't make an entire amount of sense. However, when you think about what blockchain introduces as a technology into identity, it gives people a chance to prove who they are. They can really claim to be whomever they want, but you need other people to testify it. And what I want to bring it into is really community, and the sense of like your identity tends to be where you stand within your community, whether it's the government or it's your local community. Mm-hmm. And often the people that we're looking to help are not actually tech savvy. And in fact, they've been kicked out of our communities, and they don't really want to be a part of our community because they feel like they aren't even a part of it to begin with, and they were kicked out. And every time they try to get back in, it seems like they're reminded that they're not supposed to be inside, so they stop trying. So I think this gives the people an opportunity to earn trust by, slowly coming back in, earning trust within the community, and the community understanding what identity means for people, giving them the means to like have food, to work, and to maybe link their identity with a home.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely valid point. That we are who issued our documents, right? In actuality, like, we are what we do, right? And so wouldn't it be nice if we could actually record transactional history in a safe way about what we do, which establishes a reputation in the context of, let's take, for example, a smallhold farmer, right? The issues with smallhold farmers is they're essentially living usually a subsistence lifestyle. And part of the reason they're living a subsistence lifestyle is because the goods go through 5 or 6 hands before they actually get purchased on a commercial market for many very different value, right? And so the actual value of the person doing the physical labor, particularly in a smallhold farmer scenario, is not recognized in that exchange of value. And so if a smallhold farmer had a way to record their transactions at the co-op that was attached to their history, if they had a way to record the land that they farm, right? These are all assets, right? And transactional assets which create an economic history for that person, which then can be recognized in a digital form in a world market in a way that is just not possible today. So that's an example of transitioning from I am the documents that I've been given, right, to I am the transactional reputational history that I've established.
Yeah, and I think an underlying question in all of this really is, what is identity? That is something that is kind of difficult to define, in the sense that, well, there's this one guy that I follow on Medium that I read about a lot. His name is Stephen Young. He's kind of like a cryptocurrency evangelist that talks a lot about the subject. And he states that identity is not for us to describe. We don't even own it, in the sense that it's kind of something that we put out there. It's the government's job to give us these documents that confirm who we are. And then the definition by itself doesn't really include us. It's just, I already know who I am. It's a construct for others to see and represent me. Like, my identity is not for my benefit. It's so that others can place me and understand me, and then in their universe, and then act accordingly. That is sort of something that he's coined over the years. It's not something that I fully agree with. I think that there's another sense of identity there that's missing, that's lacking. And I think that's what we're currently kind of like engaging in. But it's interesting to me to think about like whether there could be like an other word to describe it, whether we could take into account not just, you know, who I am as a person in a government registry in my birth certificate, but also like what are my actions? What have I done that truly defines me? And I don't think that we have a system in place for that.
Well, I mean, just really quickly, sort of translating that into blockchain and identity is, you know, first of all, we have to recognize that the value proposition and opportunity with decentralized systems is systemic, right? It's a systemic change, right? And so it's not going to happen overnight just because we want it to happen. But there is a very big value proposition associated with this that, you know, sort of changes the fabric of how we think about the borders of institutions from a security perimeter perspective, among other things. And so when we think about identities, yes, the driver's license is an important credential, right? That allows me to drive in a particular jurisdiction, right? A passport is an important credential. And in the context of identity, these are essentially verifiable credentials from an institution, which we call a relying party. And that construct is actually built into this idea of a consumer-owned identity, which helps to establish part of your reputational history, right? That you can know that I have this credential which says I'm allowed to drive, and that is an important part, right? It's not that it's not important, it's just that the way we issue it today and the way we think about it today is, to William's point, you know, that I am documented and therefore I have an identity, which is completely wrong, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think identity is an access to services, and the way that it's established right now is discriminatory. And if we go back to York's smallhold farmer example and think about what would enable that person to access other services from the government, for example, in the middle of a pandemic, do they have the reputation to access those services quickly? Because they're mostly invisible in the system otherwise. And right now they don't. Mm-hmm. So the final question I have, and then we'll move to Q&A, is how would this pandemic look differently if we had a digital identity system on the blockchain? Mm-hmm. And we'll start with Adam.
Well, you queued that up perfectly. I think one of the real benefits of digital identity is the transparency that it provides, right? So today, when we talk about being known by our reputations, or essentially living in a world of a network of trust, so often when there's not transparency, these trust vectors, as it were, they go into these black boxes, and we're not 100% sure what goes on within that. Now, this is not to say that a digital identity fixes that, but certainly a digital identity allows for tools to make transparency a lot more available. And so, for example, in the way that the government has been issuing the PPP loans, right now it's very dependent on which bank you have, and inside your bank there are typically very opaque rules which specify who gets the loans first and who doesn't. Like I said, this is not to say that digital identity would definitely fix that, but certainly it would allow for more avenues for transparency. Additionally, in a lot of the work that we are doing, within the blockchain space, it opens up this ability to do peer-to-peer trustless transactions, which is awesome. However, when all of a sudden you're dealing with a large organization or a large government, they oftentimes demand to be respected more than a simple peer would, right? And so the government doesn't care if your opinion of their trustworthiness is high or low. They're going to issue you a passport regardless, and legally demand that you accept that. And so I certainly think there is a space that we're moving to in the future where some of that trust is derived from a trust vector, right? Where governments have authority because a lot of people believe that there's authority, but there's an interim step where that has to be built, and that's the place where we live right now, where governments are not. They're not just happy to let that play out in the next 3 years, and rather it's up to folks like us to kind of figure out how do we work within that system that doesn't necessarily want to be represented in a web of trust scenario, and how do we build that in? And so, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So it's really interesting, Adam, that you talk about trying to apply for these small business loans, and we've talked about what is identity, and I had a very powerful and interesting conversation with somebody who had a completely polar opposite view than me about the protests that are happening in the United States. And I'm under the belief that stay at home, the protests will prolong this entire ordeal. But he said something to me that was an opinion that I never thought about, and he said, you're talking about, safety of individuals and lowering the death rate. And he goes, I'm also talking about safety of individuals and lowering the death rate. He said, some of these small business owners, these are family businesses. These were businesses that they're hoping to pass down to their children, that were passed down from their parents, that have been in the family for 60 years. And these businesses will not survive. He said, so you're talking about the death of an individual, and I'm talking about the death of somebody's identity. And that was kind of this very mind-blowing sort of conversation. And so we continued to have these very polar views, but what we ended up resulting in was this amazing conclusion that we had both agreed on. I said, we are talking about identity here. One might be that very legal identity of a death certificate versus a birth certificate, but you are talking about a type of identity that blockchain very much is inclusive on. Your work history is your identity. Who you are employed by in your career is part of your identity. And so I was so quick to be very angry at these protesters, but I didn't take that time to have this empathetic view of, to them, their identity was being taken away and it was being killed. And so what we came to the conclusion of is, I said, do you think that the protest would still be happening if people felt that they had access to financial banking and stability? If these small businesses could get access to small business loans, if people were being given enough stipends like they were in other countries to keep them afloat and keep their heads above water. So do you think that these protests would still be happening? He said, no, I don't think so, because people would feel that their identity is secure. And so it's a really interesting way to think about, if people were able to access the funds that they needed to support their businesses, to support their families, and if that data was available on the blockchain and easier, would we be having this COVID backlash that we're currently experiencing?
Well, just to put it in context, it's actually a fairly small backlash, right, from a number of protesters' perspective. But I love how you were able to have that conversation, because it is, the point is well taken, is that the protest is against a fallibility in the government, right, about being able to get funding where it needs to go in a way that is ubiquitous and without, to Adam's point, people's thumb on the scale, right, based on relationships that they might have in a banking institution. So I would look at sort of the value proposition of blockchain and consumer-owned identities in two ways as it relates to this situation that we're in around the pandemic. One is with technologies like blockchain, we, in theory, could do a lot better job in tracing without revealing the types of privacy data that we don't want to have revealed, right, forevermore. That's obviously too long a technical discussion to have right now, but there's a number of people working on that. By the way, there's also many other interesting approaches. I saw one using random numbers to represent tracing, essentially, of individuals, basically similar to a derived key type of scenario, right, where it's used for a specific purpose for those in the blockchain crowd. And then the other point, and I actually tweeted about this, copying Andrew Yang for good reason, which is, just imagine if we had blockchain-based, public utility-based, decentralized identifiers. I mean, we could basically do an airdrop right now and send money to everybody. right? And so, like, you think about the transformational opportunity that people are just not seeing because they're fighting about political fights, right? Like, if we all had a public utility-based decentralized identity, we would not have those protests happening. We would not have the problems of getting $1,200 or checks for unemployment, right, through antiquated processes. And that would actually, from a like integration perspective, not be hard, right? The hardest thing would be to basically get people to have these established identities. And so when we think about this from a Microsoft perspective, we sort of look at what are the levers that Microsoft has to help establish these systemic changes, right? And this is why I'm so I applaud the work that's going on in our identity team, because this is how they think about the world. They think about what can we do as an institution to help drive forward to what we know is actually a digital transformative opportunity, like consumer-owned identities. And so, a lot of the work that they've been talking about is like, think about some of the assets that Microsoft has that they could use to help to, make the systemic change happen. A great example is Active Directory, which certainly in Austin is probably in use, right, as a permissioning and employee identification system. It would be amazing if we could issue decentralized identities to employees, right? That would cover 80% of the employee base of the world, right, based on where Active Directory is deployed. There's other assets like LinkedIn, which is more of a consumer-facing asset that also could play an interesting role in verified identities and verified reputations. So I'll leave it there. Great discussion, and pass it back over to you, Mary.
Yeah, and I think the next level to what you're saying, York, is so not only would it be much more simple if everybody had a digital identity that they could airdrop money into, but the qualifying credentials could be more equitable in order to access those funds. Mm-hmm. So right now, in order to access the $1,200 lump sum payment from the government, you have to file your taxes, and the type of people that might be missing from that system are people experiencing homelessness, the unbanked, people working the cash economy. And those are probably people who need the money more than a salaried worker who can file their taxes in the midst of this crisis. Yeah. So it's not only would blockchains operationalize this, this process better, but it would also create new opportunities to rethink equity within government services. Yeah. And so we have a bunch of questions, and we have 4 minutes. So we're going to move on to the questions. I was a bad moderator in that sense.
Go a little bit over too. It's no problem.
Okay. I'll start with the first one from Brian Bellendorf in the Q&A in Zoom. Have government authorities been open or resistant to the use of cryptocurrency networks for publishing identity public keys?
Great question, Brian, and thank you for joining. I would say that from the perspective of, I wouldn't necessarily call them cryptocurrency public keys, although that's what they are, which is why I very specifically use the word public utility. I think that the challenge is that we have work to do to recognize the value proposition associated with many aspects of the public utility stacks, all the way down to the cryptography curves, right? If we can get that work done, right, then I think we can get to the ability for governments to rationalize what a public utility value proposition is.
That's right, and I think that it kind of varies, state by state, city by city. But I think that at least in Austin, we have an opportunity to run a pilot to discover really the value of what we're doing here. And there's a lot of ears listening. So hopefully, other cities, other states can pick up what we leave off. And yeah, we'll have some big change.
Yeah, and by the way,
additionally, I also think it grows in niches. Right, and so I doubt that at the federal level we're all just going to get a DID attached to our social security number. But I absolutely do see the proliferation of these things, niche by niche, as different organizations actually sign up.
I totally agree, by the way, and that's why I'm so excited about the work that you guys are doing in Austin, because it is an opportunity to establish a value proposition without actually sort of poking people in the eye, right?
That's right.
With the problem, right? So it's fantastic work that you're doing.
A really interesting question, and I think it's something that we've all talked about before in one way or another. What of people who don't want or cannot intellectually manage their identity? Is there a new business opportunity for a third party to provide that service? And a follow-up I have to that question is, what opportunity is there for exploitation of people if there's a third party provider?
I mean, this is the work you guys are thinking about, right, in Austin, pretty hard.
Yeah. A big component of this is governance. So who do we leave off this project when we're done with it, right? And we've discussed it a lot. We don't know what the answer to that is yet. Obviously, there's a lot of unintended consequences that could come off of this. So we got to be very, very careful about auditing, about permissions tables, about who has control over this platform. And again, like Adam said, we're making a lot of this private by design, in the sense that even the people that have access to these documents, that run the platform, cannot have access to your documents because everything is encrypted. So, yeah.
We did talk. We talked about the concept of guardians in the past, and that was really to attest and like vouch for if you want to check into some type of treatment center, and that's going to give you a home and some mental health. People want to know that you actually are doing something, and you will attest for that. And you can set up these guardians, and they're almost like sponsors for you. And when you come out of these things, they try to hook you back up with your sponsor. And we've been toying with ideas of using these guardians to be able to recover your keys in other types of proof of identity scenarios. So I could easily see when if you're just incapable of holding a phone or remembering your name, electing guardians, whether they're state provided or they're ones that you get to designate.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, so at back to sort of the principles that we have to establish around protecting people from what they don't know, like backup and recovery schemes. There have been many attempts at different schemes, particularly in the blockchain community, around this, because it is a problem, right? Like if you lose your key, you're, or your pass, your phrase, you're kind of in trouble, right? And so how do you protect these things in a way where you're not delegating authority to a single entity? So a lot of people have come up with different types of MFN type of scenarios, whether it's Shamir keys or things like that. So the ability to understand the risk of delegating a portion of that MFN responsibility to an entity is actually probably the most important part from a user experience perspective, or not allowing people to do things that would create too high risk, right? And just we would have to take an algorithmic approach to that. But at the fundamental protocol level, MFN schemes are how you would actually do that. Obviously, with appropriate research and testing around, if I were to delegate one of the parts of the ability to recover that, what is the risk associated with that, or 2 or 3, or and this is actually a pretty fascinating area of work that my colleague Daniel Butchner has been driving with our research team at Microsoft, and he's been talking about it quite a bit, and I think they're actually going to do some publishing in the next couple of weeks. So,
well, both understanding the risks and as well how we assess consent is also really tricky in that area, right? Did people consent to your thing because they understood the risks, or did they consent because you made it a gate for them to actually move forward within your system?
Yeah.
And so
I accept all cookies.
Yeah, right.
That actually brings up a really, really good point, which revolving around people experiencing homelessness, it becomes a lot more tricky than your average person. One thing that I realized very quickly is a lot of these people are primed to giving their stuff away. Their social security number, they get asked it so often that it's like, I was talking to this girl who was part of the innovation team, who was kind of like the harbingers of my past before we came along. And Sarah, she told me this very interesting story about how when she was interviewing someone, she was filling out a form and the person wrote their social security number on the form, which was not asked for or needed anywhere. So it's interesting to think about how can we avoid that. And by focusing on the most vulnerable population, I think we design for everyone, because obviously they're the most prone to these kinds of pitfalls. I think you're muted, Mary.
Hello. One final question. What happens to our identities after we die? Will our identity be deleted? Will I have to update my will? Could I assign my rights to my successors?
I think this one is incredibly fascinating, and I can't believe I'm making this reference, but it makes me think of Tiger King, when Carol Baskin's the will that was originally assigned disappeared, and then all of a sudden a new one appeared. And it's yes, but that's the thing with wills. And I used to work for a lot of lawyers, and when it comes to wills, trusts, and estates, it is a very, very, very messy thing. I mean, it rips families apart. People will waste all their money, all of the money left in the will, to fight a will and who it should be left to. And they didn't agree with how it was broken down and all these things. And so I think one of the interesting things about blockchain is that it creates a much stronger and stricter ruling to how your identity and what your assets, how they will be designated. And so when we talk about, death, I think it's very likely that in the future you can assign somebody to be the inheritor of your identity and the assets that are associated with it. And I think in a way it could become even more legally binding than a will, because it's public data. You cannot argue with it. It's on the chain. I think the way in which wills can get altered or removed, as you've seen, or they can get fought, and then they get tied up in court for years, if not more. There's a whole thing about was this person legally sane when the will was written? And there's people that try to break will contracts by saying, well, they weren't in a right state of mind when this was done. I think utilizing blockchain and creating attestation, as well as sort of supervisors or agents, if you will, sponsors that can agree and say, hey, like, this has been agreed to, all these public parties noted it is supported, it is documented, it cannot be broken. I mean, I think that's a way to really kind of clear up the after the death fact, because you can assign identity and assets to a sort of successor, and that could be something that you can control after death.
I totally agree with that. I mean, the value proposition of a public utility with a public key that's owned by a consumer or constituent is that, if you think about it from a cryptocurrency perspective, it's an asset, right? And so all of the same things that you would do with that property, you could do with someone's identity and all of the associated things with that, right? And so I think it's a really fascinating question and opportunity for sure. It does go to the longevity question, right? Like, which is, have we had any technology, digital technology, which has maintained a record for 100 years, right? This is a problem. One of the reasons, by the way, why, if you've seen in the last couple of months, Microsoft was working with the Superman franchise to create a glass-etched permanent storage, essentially, because that type of storage medium will last, virtually forever, or at least until the temperature gets too high.
Well, in addition to that, the 100 years question is a good one, but do any of us have digital photographs that were taken before 2002?
Agreed.
And the answer is probably no.
Right.
Even though such things did exist, we've lost them on a computer and whatnot, and our understanding of time scale is so small that we assume that stuff will just last, even though our experience has shown that it didn't.
Yep.
On that note, I would like to thank Miami University Blockchain Club and Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition for bringing us all together.